Actaeon is a hunter in Greek mythology, who loses his human life as the price of seeing a goddess. Most people reduce this myth to something very simple. He happened to see Artemis, and he was punished for it. But is that really all there is to it? Was he just an unlucky victim? Or was he a proud man whose fault we tend to overlook? This story still gets retold, because even the ancient versions do not give us one clean answer. In some tellings, he feels like a man who stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time. In others, he looks like someone who clearly crossed a line. So this is not just a story about why Artemis got angry. It is also a story about why this myth still leaves us unsure. Whose side to take? To begin with, Actaeon is not a man who knows nothing about the woods. He is not some lost traveler with a bow in his hand. He is a skilled hunter. He moves with dogs and spears. He knows how to read tracks, follow the wind, and sense what the forest is telling him. In other words, he is not weak before nature. He belongs to the side that thinks it can handle nature. That is part of what makes this myth so striking. The man who is used to chasing suddenly becomes the one being chased. The man who thinks he knows the land loses his way at the worst possible moment. Greek myth often works like this. It turns human confidence inside out, and reminds us that the world we think we know may never have been ours to control. In the version most people know, the day does not begin in any dramatic way. The hunt is winding down. The heat of noon has settled over the woods. Actaeon tells his companions that they have done enough for the day. Let's stop here. We can come back tomorrow. It is time to head back. The line matters because it feels so ordinary. Great tragedy rarely announces itself. It often begins right after a moment that feels completely normal. Actaeon walks on alone for a while, and goes a little deeper into the forest than he should. That one step is the whole problem. The place he enters is not just another part of the woods. Trees, rocks, and water may look the same everywhere, but not every place carries the same meaning. The forest where humans hunt and the forest where a god rests may look similar on the surface, yet they belong to very different kinds of order. There is a clear spring there. Light breaks across the water. Moss, stone, and shade create a silence that feels cut off from the outside world. This is not a place for pursuit. It is a place for rest, stillness, and privacy. And that place belongs to Artemis. Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, but she is not simply a goddess with a bow. She stands for something harder to hold onto than that. She is untamed. She cannot be owned. She represents a kind of freedom that does not belong to human hands. She seems close to the human world, yet never fully part of it. That is why there is always an invisible boundary around her. A line between what can be entered and what cannot. Between what may be seen and what should not be seen. Between what humans can bear and what they cannot. In this myth, Artemis is bathing with her nymphs, resting after the hunt, in a moment that belongs to no one else's gaze. And then Actaeon sees her. This is the part most people remember. A man sees a goddess, and the goddess is enraged. But this scene stays with people not because it is simple, but because it is so hard to judge. In the most famous version, Actaeon does not seem like a man who set out to spy on her. He does not sneak in with bad intent. He does not insult her. He does not reach for her. He just enters the place and ends up seeing what he was never meant to see. That is what makes the myth uncomfortable. By human standards, he looks less like a villain, and more like someone with terrible luck. Anyone can lose their way. Anyone can step into the wrong place without meaning to. But myth does not move only by human standards. If we read Artemis's anger as nothing more than a burst of emotion, the story becomes flat. What she protects is not just pride. It is a boundary. It is the order that defines who she is, what world she stands for, and what must remain untouched. So Actaeon's offense may not simply be that he looked. It may be that his human gaze reached a place it was never supposed to reach. Whether he meant to or not matters to us. But inside the myth, the result may matter more. The boundary has been broken. A goddess's private stillness has been exposed to human sight. Artemis takes water in her hand and throws it at him. Then she tells him to go ahead and speak of what he has seen, if he can. That line matters because it is more than a curse. It means that once his gaze crosses that line, he will no longer even be able to explain himself. In that instant, Actaeon begins to change. Horns rise from his head. His body loses its human shape. His feet become the legs of a deer. He is turned into a stag. But the deeper tragedy is not his body. It is his mind. He still knows who he is. He understands what is happening. He knows he was human. He knows no one will recognize him now. His form changes, but his awareness remains. This is where the myth becomes truly unsettling. If he had become an animal with no memory, the story might feel less cruel. But Actaeon knows exactly what he has lost. He knows why he is running. He knows what he can no longer say. He runs through the forest, but now he is not running as a hunter. He is running to survive. The fear he once saw from the outside now fills his own body. In that moment, it is not only his appearance that changes. His whole place in the world flips upside down. Then his hunting dogs find him. That part of the myth is especially tragic, because what pursues him is not some unknown enemy. These are the creatures that once ran beside him. They knew his touch. They followed his voice. But now they no longer know him. And the myth quietly asks a brutal question. What does it mean to know someone? If the face changes, if the voice is gone, if the body is different, can we still recognize the person? Actaeon may hear his own name being called. He may hear his companions urging the dogs on, telling each other not to lose the animal, calling for Actaeon as if he were not already there. But he can no longer prove who he is. He cannot pull himself back into other people's memory. He is shut out of his own world. If we stop there, the natural reaction is simple. This feels too harsh. Did he really deserve that? In the best-known version, that feeling is strong. He seems like a man ruined by misfortune, and Artemis's punishment feels severe. That is why some people read this myth as a story about divine cruelty. Humans make mistakes, but the gods do not forgive them. From a modern point of view, that reading makes sense. We tend to draw a sharp line between malice and accident. But then the story turns again. In other tellings, Actaeon appears in a very different light. Some versions say he boasted that he was a better hunter than Artemis. If that is the version we follow, then the heart of the story shifts. It is no longer about a chance glance. It becomes a story about pride. In that version, Actaeon is not simply unlucky. He is a man who believed too deeply in his own skill and placed himself beside a goddess. That changes the whole tone of the myth. The punishment can still feel frightening or excessive, but at least the direction of the story becomes clearer. In that reading, he is not a tragic victim. He is a warning about human arrogance. What makes this even more interesting is that the difference between these versions does not feel accidental. Greek myths often leave room for more than one meaning. One age may have seen Actaeon as a pitiful man. Another may have seen him as a proud one. Some may have used his story to show the cold power of the gods. Others may have used it to show what happens when a mortal crosses a sacred line. That is why Actaeon cannot be pinned down so easily. And that is exactly why the myth stays alive. If it were only a neat moral lesson, we would not keep coming back to it. But this story refuses to let us decide too quickly. Who was right? What counted as justice? Where a mistake ends, and where arrogance begins? One of the first things this myth makes me think about is the power of seeing. We often act as if seeing is harmless. We say, "I only looked." We treat sight as lighter than touch, safer than action. But this story pushes back against that idea. A gaze can cross distance. It can pull someone into our frame. It can turn another being into something we think we understand. Even if Actaeon saw Artemis by accident, his eyes still entered a space that was closed to human vision. The myth takes that idea to an extreme. Some things do not become clearer when we move closer. Some things are damaged by the very act of being seen. That is why this story feels larger than one goddess getting angry. It becomes a story about how easily human sight can cross a line without even noticing. At the same time, this myth also shows how easily skill turns into pride. Actaeon is a hunter. He believes he understands the forest. He believes he can track, judge, and master what moves inside it. Then the myth places him on the other side in an instant. He is no longer the pursuer but the pursued. No longer the one who names and judges, but the one who runs on instinct. No longer a person who can speak for himself, but a being whose identity cannot be proven. This is more than punishment. It is a reversal of position. Human beings get used to their place very quickly. The strong assume their place is natural. The articulate rarely imagine the fear of not being able to speak. But Actaeon is forced to feel in his own body the fear he once saw only from the outside. In that sense, this myth is not only about divine anger. It is also about how easily human beings mistake their own position for something permanent. The dogs matter too. They are not evil. They are not driven by hatred. They act out of training, instinct, and loyalty to the role they have always played. And yet that loyalty becomes part of the tragedy. In that way, the myth feels strangely close to human life. Some of the worst harm in the world does not come from open cruelty. It comes from habits that no one questions, actions repeated because they are familiar, obedience that never pauses to ask what it is doing. You do not need hatred to fail someone completely. Sometimes all it takes is the inability to recognize who is standing in front of you. What destroys Actaeon is not only the curse, it is the fact that even those closest to him can no longer see him for who he is. So this is not just a story about transformation. It is also a story about misrecognition, about the loneliness of still being yourself when no one else can see it. It is also hard to sum up Artemis with one easy judgment. If we simply call her cruel, the story becomes easier to digest. But it also loses what makes it strange. Artemis is not a figure who exists to satisfy human ideas of fairness. She stands for a distance older than civilization, for the silence of things that should not be touched, for a freedom that cannot be owned. Expecting that kind of goddess to act like a patient human judge may already be too human a way of looking at the myth. That does not mean her actions feel comfortable. In fact, the discomfort is the point. The gods in myth do not always move in ways that fit our moral expectations. Sometimes they are cold. Sometimes they act in ways that resist easy defense. That is what pushes us to imagine an order outside ourselves. And in the end, I think this myth also asks what human dignity rests on. If the body changes, are you still you? If you lose your voice, how much of you remains? If no one else recognizes you, can you still hold on to your own humanity? Actaeon still knows who he is, but the world no longer answers to that identity. And maybe one of the deepest human fears is not simply death, but the loss of being legible to others. The moment when you still feel like yourself on the inside, but the world reads you as something else. That is one reason this myth still feels so modern. Most of us will never become a stag in a forest, but almost everyone knows what it feels like to be misunderstood, misread, or no longer recognized for who they are. So I do not think this story should end with a clean verdict. It is not enough to say that Actaeon was only an innocent victim. And it is not enough to say that he was simply a guilty man who got what he deserved. A more honest ending might be this. From a human point of view, he seems to suffer a punishment that feels far too severe. From the point of view of divine order inside the myth, he may still be a man who crossed a sacred line. And because those two views never fully come together, the story keeps its power. What this myth gives us is not a simple answer about who was right. It gives us a reminder that there are limits our judgments cannot fully settle. Maybe that is why myths last. Not because they give us easy answers, but because they leave behind questions we cannot close so quickly. The story of Actaeon does exactly that. It is not just a strange old tale about a man turned into an animal. It asks how far human sight should go when talent becomes arrogance. Why boundaries matter, and how important it is to be recognized by others. That is why this myth still feels alive. The forest may belong to an old story, but the gaze, the desire, and the human mistake behind it still belong to us. In the end, Actaeon is both a hunter who loses his life because of a single look, and a figure who reflects the way human beings misunderstand their own limits. You can read him as a tragic victim. You can read him as a warning against pride. But whichever side you lean toward, one thing stays clear. This myth leaves behind a powerful sense that the way we look at the world is never completely harmless, and that not every boundary exists only to hold us back. That is why the story of Artemis and Actaeon remains more than a tale of punishment. It becomes an old test of how far human beings can go, and where they may need to stop.